These men believed they could escape justice, continuing their crimes in plain sight. Arrogant and self-assured, they never imagined they'd be caught, until their own egos led to their downfall. Get ready to dive into some of the most mind-bending and shocking cases that will challenge everything you think you know. A quick warning, one of these cases includes uncensored crime scene video footage. Let's get started. Alright, we gotta talk about this place, Fox Hollow Farm. Ever heard of it? It's this eerie, secluded property just outside Indianapolis. Sounds like your average peaceful countryside estate, right? Well, it's got a history so chilling it could make your skin crawl. Stick around to the end to see a creepy news interview that the suspect gave outside of his home before being caught. Back in the 90s, this guy named Herb Baumeister lived there. To the outside world, he seemed like an average, if not eccentric, family man. He owned this successful chain of thrift stores. He had a wife, kids, the whole American dream thing. But behind closed doors, this guy was a straight-up psychopath. So let's set the scene. Fox Hollow Farm is this huge wooded property, 18 acres, with a big stately house. It's got an indoor pool, a carriage house, and this almost too perfect suburban aesthetic for the time. But there was something really off about Herb. His behavior was strange, erratic even, and his marriage, pretty much non-existent. His wife later admitted they hadn't even been intimate in years. But here's where things take a dark turn. Around that time, young men were disappearing from Indianapolis, particularly from the gay community. Guys would go out to bars, never to be seen again. The police were stumped. No bodies, no leads, just missing people, vanishing into thin air. Eventually, one guy survived an encounter. We'll call this survivor Tony to protect his identity. So Tony went to the police and described being taken to this estate where Brian, who was actually Herb, tried to strangle him during a bizarre erotic game. Tony described this bizarre scene upon entering the pool area. There were several life-sized mannequins dressed in formal attire placed around the room. Herb would position them as if though they were attending some kind of high society party. The idea of him committing such acts while being surrounded by these lifeless figures just adds to the layers of creepiness. Tony gave a statement about that night stating that Brian was well-dressed, charismatic, but a little odd. Brian invited Tony back to his house for drinks and a swim. Tony agreed and got into his car. Tony described arriving at a large upscale home with an indoor pool. Brian offered him a drink, and then they talked for a while. As the night progressed, Brian suggested autoerotic asphyxiation. First, Tony did it to Brian, and then Tony agreed to let Brian do it to him with a hose. But at some point, he realized Brian wasn't letting go. Tony fought back at first, then pretended to pass out, at which point Brian released his grip. When Tony sat up, Brian acted as if nothing had happened, smiling and joking. He told Tony that his previous partners had really enjoyed it and that some hadn't been able to handle it. Tony knew something was deeply wrong and suspected that Brian had killed the others this way. He managed to stay calm, make an excuse to leave, and got out of the house safely. Now this one detective, Mary Wilson, started investigating. She kept hearing the same name pop up, Brian Smart. This guy would pick up men at bars, take them back to his place, some fancy house with a pool, and almost none of them ever returned. About a year later, Tony saw Herb at a bar. He asked his friend to get the tags on the car that Herb was driving so he could turn it into the police. But the tags didn't come back to Brian Smart. Instead, they belonged to Herb Baumeister. Police went to the store Herb owned to question him. Herb tried to deny being in that part of town, but he couldn't deny the fact that his car was seen outside a bar and his tags were recorded. Even though his demeanor was off, you can't arrest someone just based on the vibes they give you. So the police had to come up with a game plan. They decided they would talk to Herb's wife, Julie. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Julie told the police she had been married for 25 years and never even saw Herb yell at the kids or even grab her arm during an argument. She told them they must have the wrong guy and refused to let the police search the home or property. One thing Julie left out, though, was that her 15-year-old son had found bones in the yard not too long ago. Julie went out to the woods, saw the bones, and told her husband about them when he got home. Herb gave some excuse that they had belonged to his father when he was a doctor. Because Herb was a borderline hoarder and never got rid of anything, this didn't seem too far-fetched. Julie told Herb to clean them up and never thought about them again. That was until the police came knocking. Of course, she didn't think to mention it at the time. After much thought and deliberation, Julie allowed a search of Fox Hollow Farm.
That's until Detective Wilson got a call from Julie Baumeister's attorney.
If anyone at this stage of the game is a victim, I think it would be his wife and his family.
She had a story to share.
Court records show that Juliana Baumeister contacted police through her attorney last Monday and took them to a section of her property where in December of 1994 she had observed possible human remains, including a skull and bones.
What police uncovered was something straight out of a horror movie. Behind the house, near the woods, they found human bones. Not just one, not just two, but dozens. The soil was littered with skeletal remains, so many that they couldn't even get a full count at first. It was like a graveyard hidden in plain sight. They estimated Herb had killed at least 11 men, but some suspected the number was much higher. Julie filed for divorce shortly after, but how could she have not known anything was going on? Well, apparently Julie and the kids went out of town a lot, on the weekends and in the summer, and they went to the family's lake house while Herb stayed behind to tend to the business. It seems that all of Herb's horrific encounters occurred when the family was away. Herb also had strict control over the household and kept parts of their home off limits. Julie later admitted she was never allowed near certain areas of the property, including parts of the backyard where he had buried remains. She never seemed to question her husband about anything, just assumed he was working or stressed. Apparently, Herb and Julie had only been intimate a handful of times during their marriage, which might have led her to be less suspicious of him when he was sneaking out or hiding things from her. Herb Baumeister could easily blend in with society, but many people found him unsettling. Even seeing his picture gives us the creeps. He is the definition of living a double life. A reserved businessman by day and a predatory killer by night, making him especially dangerous. If Tony hadn't come forward and thought to get the license plate number, Herb could have gone on to hurt many more men. Herb, though, he never faced justice. Before they could arrest him, he fled to Canada and took his own life, leaving behind a note which he rambled on about stress and personal failures, but never once mentioned the victims. Total coward move, if you ask us. Here's the bonus news interview of Herb we promised.
The Indiana Department of Transportation maintains over 11,000 miles of roadway, and we paint those miles of roadway each year, and this is just an isolated incident that happened.
The drive-by striping, whatever.
Herb Baumeister of Carmel saw it all.
I said to my son, they're gonna hit that raccoon with the spray gun, and sure enough, they just striped right over its face and neck. Didn't even move it, no effort to, get it out of the way. So I happened to have a Polaroid with me, so I took a shot at the thing.
A raccoon, which met its demise on the yellow line, became one with the paint. The raccoon has since been removed. This is all that's left.
This was just, the painter should have had a chalk line drawn around his career by state officials. There was no excuse for that. The poor thing deserved a better fate than that.
Honestly, did he really care about the raccoon, or was this another show he was putting on? Why'd he need to take a picture of it? There has been a renewed interest in this case as of 2022. More victims have been identified. Currently, there are approximately 10,000 bone fragments trying to be identified. The process is slow because a lot of the remains were crushed or burnt. We hope that one day all of the remains will be identified. But what do you think of this case?
Have y'all heard about the Candyman? No, not that Candyman. The Candyman we're talking about abducted, essayed, tortured, and murdered at least 28 young men and teenage boys in the 1970s. This American serial killer was also called the Houston Mass Murderer and the Pied Piper. This Candyman was Dean Corll. His mother owned Corll Candy Company, where he lured boys and young men with free candy.
Dean Corll was born on December 24, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Corll had one younger brother, Stanley. His parents, Mary and Arnold, didn't get along, and his father was strict and his mother was overly protective of both boys. Corll's parents divorced when Stanley was 4 years old. After the divorce, Arnold was drafted by the Air Force, and Mary relocated to Memphis to allow the boys to still have contact with their dad.
Coral was described as a shy, serious child that didn't socialize much with other children. He was also really sensitive to rejection and criticism of any kind. In 1950, Coral's parents tried to fix their relationship and remarried. The family moved to Pasadena, Texas. Unfortunately, Mary and Arnold just couldn't make it work, and after 3 years, they divorced again. Mary had custody of the boys, and Arnold maintained regular contact with them.
Mary would go on to marry again. Jake West was a traveling clock salesman. The Coral family moved once again to another place in Texas. Mary had a little girl with Jake in 1955 and named her Joyce Janine. Mary and Jake started a small candy company out of their garage. Coral and his brother were in charge of running the candy-making machines and packing the candy. Coral had to work day and night while still going to school. Jake went to Houston a lot, and this is where the candy sold the best. While Coral attended high school, he was a good student and well-behaved, but was thought of as a loner.
Once Coral graduated school in the summer of 1958, the family moved to the outskirts of Houston. Jake started a new candy shop called Pecan Prince. At the request of his mother, Coral moved to Indiana to live with his grandma in 1960. Coral had a steady relationship with a girl, but ended up turning down her marriage proposal in 1962. Shortly after that, he returned to Houston to help with the family business. Coral's mom just didn't have any luck in the love department. She and Jake divorced in 1963, and she started her own candy shop, Coral Candy Company. Coral was named the vice president of the new company, while his younger brother was the secretary-treasurer.
Within a year of starting the new candy business, a teenage boy that was working there complained to Mary about Coral making advances towards him. Mary fired the teenager. Not long after this incident, Coral was drafted by the Army and was assigned to Fort Polk, Louisiana for basic training. He hated being in the military and applied for a hardship discharge on the grounds that his mother needed help with the family business. Coral's military records were unblemished and he was granted an honorable discharge. Coral told some of his close acquaintances during his time in the military he realized that he was attracted to men and had experienced his first same-sex experience. People noticed that Coral's mannerisms towards males had changed, especially towards younger men and teenage boys.
Once Coral was back in Houston, he resumed his role as vice president of Coral Candy Company. Jake, Coral's ex-stepfather, still ran Pecan Prince, and the competition was fierce between the two shops. Coral expanded his working hours to fill the public's increasing demand for his family's products. The Coral Candy Company was relocated in 1965 directly across the street to an elementary school. Coral began giving the school kids free candy, especially teen boys. This is how he earned the nicknames Candyman and Pied Piper. The Coral Candy Company employed several teenage boys. Coral was very flirty with them. He even put a pool table in the back of the shop to encourage employees and the local youth to hang out.
In 1967, one of the boys that Coral gave free candy to became one of his young accomplices. David Owen Brooks was only 12 at the time. Brooks often rode with Coral to South Texas. Later, Brooks commented that Coral was the only adult that didn't make fun of his appearance, and he began to see Coral as a sort of father figure. If Brooks needed money, he would go to Coral, and Coral would give it to him. Brooks' parents were divorced, and he lived with his mother in Beaumont, but his father lived in Houston. So when Brooks visited his father, he always made time to see Coral.
In 1968, the Coral Candy Company closed, and Coral's mother and sister moved to Colorado. Mary would talk to Coral often on the phone, but never saw him again. After the candy company closed, Coral became an electrician. Life seemed to go on more or less normal for Coral. In 1969, Coral began making advances towards Brooks, even going as far as allowing him to perform acts on him. Brooks dropped out of school at 15 and ended up moving back to Houston. He often stayed at Coral's and saw it as a second home.
The normalcy would end in 1970 when Coral killed his first victim. Jeffrey Conan, an 18-year-old college student. Jeffrey disappeared while hitchhiking with another student from University of Texas. Jeffrey was headed to his parents' house in Houston and was dropped off alone on a street corner in the uptown area of town. It is believed that Coral had offered Jeffrey a ride. Around the time of Jeffrey's murder, Brooks walked in on Coral essaying 2 teen boys that were tied to his bed. Coral told Brooks that if he didn't tell anyone, he would buy him a car. Brooks accepted this offer and was rewarded with a green Corvette.
Coral told Brooks that he did kill the two boys and offered him $200 for any boy he would bring to his apartment. Brooks agreed. It seemed like easy money to him. Most of Coral's victims were males between the age of 13 to 20, with the majority of them being in their mid-teens and from the low-income area Houston Heights. Later, Brooks brought another boy to Coral, but instead of causing his demise, Coral made him another accomplice for reasons unknown. His name was Elmer Wayne Henley. Most of the time, Coral didn't even pay the boys what he had promised. So instead of $200, they would get only $5 to $10 for each victim. Regardless, both boys continue helping Coral with his evil plans. Later, Henley claimed he only accepted the deal due to his family's financial hardship.
A lot of the victims were friends with Brooks or Henley, and a couple were former employees of the Coral Candy Company. Victims would be lured with the promise of a ride in the Corvette or a nearby party. Unfortunately for these young men, they would be driven to Coral's apartment instead. Often the victims would be supplied with alcohol and drugs until they passed out. They would then be handcuffed and stripped naked. We don't want to go into the details here, but most of the time, these were unwilling encounters that would last for days.
Coral would have the teen call or write their families to explain their absences. Coral would keep a keepsake from the boys, usually keys. After he was done with the victims, he would tie them up in plastic sheeting and bury them in one of 4 places: a beach in Jefferson County, Lake Sam Rayburn, a beach at Boulevard Peninsula, or at a rented boat shed in southwest Houston.
The victim list is long and heart-wrenching. In total, 28 deaths have been linked to Coral and his henchmen. December 1970, Danny Yates and James Glass, both 14, were lured by Brooks to Coral's apartment. January 1971, 2 teen boys, Donald and Jerry Waldrop, hitched a ride from Coral and were never seen again alive. Around March 1971, 15-year-old Randall Harvey was lured to the apartment. 13-year-old David Hillegeist and 16-year-old Gregory Winkle were killed together on May 29, 1971. August 1971, Brooks took an acquaintance, Reuben Haney, to Coral, where he was strangled and buried in the boat shed. December 1971, Coral abducted and killed 2 more youths. These boys are still unidentified. March 1972, Coral, Brooks, and Henley talked to an 18-year-old Frank Aguirre. Frank was offered beer and weed. He had just gotten off work and the offer was too good to pass up. Unfortunately, Frank would fall victim like all the others before and was buried at High Island Beach. By now, Brooks and Henley knew that Coral was murdering these boys, yet they continued to help. April 1972, they all knew the next victim. 17-year-old Mark Scott was grabbed by all 3 men. Mark fought against his attackers, even attempting to stab them. Then a gun was pointed at his head and he gave up. His body was never recovered. June of the same year, the trio had 2 more youths in their grips, Billy Bouch and Johnny DeLome. Henley solo killed the boys. Summer of 1972, Coral killed 2 more victims, Stephen Sickman and Royal Bunton.
Coral moved around a lot during these crimes, but usually stayed close to Houston Heights until moving to Pasadena in 1973, which was about 20 miles away. But before he moved, he killed another teenager, Joseph Lyle. Coral moved to 2020 Lamar Drive, an address where his father had lived, with no known murders occurring between March and May of 73.
However, by the summer of 73, the killings increased significantly. Brooks and Henley said that Coral's escalation was a bloodlust. Both would know when Coral wanted them to bring him a new boy, just by the way he acted. Coral would become restless, chain-smoking cigarettes, and making reflex movements, almost as if he was going through withdrawals. In June, 15-year-old William Lawrence and 20-year-old Raymond Blackburn were abducted, tortured, and killed.
Brooks married his fiancée who was pregnant at the time, so during July 1973, Henley was the only one helping Coral find, abduct, and kill victims. In July, 15-year-old Homer Garcia, an acquaintance of Henley, was going to stay the night. Homer was shot and left in Coral's tub until he was buried at the lake. Just 5 days later, John Sellers, who was 17, was also abducted and bound, shot to death, and buried. Coral's horrible crimes were finally coming to an end, but 4 more males would fall victim to the Candyman before it was all over. 15-year-old Michael Bulch, who was the brother of a previous victim from May 1972, Billy Bulch, Marty Jones, and Charles Coble. His final victim was a 13-year-old named James Dramala.
Early August 1973, Henley invited Timothy Curley over for a party at Coral's. The two were helping paint and drinking. Just shortly after midnight, Henley and Timothy left the house and said they would be back soon. The two went to Houston Heights and parked close to Henley's home. When the two got out of the car, they heard a noise coming from Rhonda Williams' house, a friend of Henley. Rhonda had been beaten by her father and didn't want to go back inside, so she went with Henley and Timothy back to Coral's house around 3 a.m. Coral was pissed that Henley brought a girl to his house because Timothy was supposed to be the next victim. Coral told Henley that he ruined everything. Henley told Coral he only brought Rhonda over because her dad had beaten her and she didn't want to go home. Coral seemed to calm down and allowed the three teenagers to drink and smoke pot. The trio passed out about 2 hours later. When the teens woke up, they were all bound and had duct tape on their mouths. Timothy had been stripped naked. Coral took Henley's tape off of his mouth to let him talk. Coral told Henley that he had really messed up by bringing the girl there, and he said he was going to kill all three of them, but only after he had his fun. Coral held a .22 pistol against Henley's stomach, threatening to shoot him. Henley told Coral that he wanted to participate in ending the other two. Coral agreed to untie him. By this point, both Timothy and Rhonda were awake and struggling to get free. Coral began to essay Timothy. Rhonda's gag was removed and she asked Henley if this was for real. Henley's only response was, yes. Rhonda asked him, "Are you going to do anything about it?"
Henley grabbed Coral's gun and shouted at him, "You've gone too far, Dean. I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends." Coral told Henley, "Kill me," and as Henley took a few steps back, Coral advanced on him. Coral was shouting, "You won't do it." Henley shot Coral in the forehead then and there. The bullet didn't penetrate his skull. Henley fired 2 more shots, hitting Coral in the shoulder. Coral then turned and ran down the hallway. As he did, Henley fired 3 more shots into Coral's back. Coral slid down the wall and died. Henley wanted to just leave the house, but the other two convinced him to call the police. August 8, 1973, at 8:24 a.m., the police were called.
At first, Henley told the police that he killed Coral in self-defense, and Timothy and Rhonda's stories corroborated this. Henley ended up telling the police everything. For almost 3 years, he and Brooks would bring Coral teenage boys so he could essay and kill them. Henley admitted that he had participated in 6 to 8 murders. He also told the police that Coral would pay him and Brooks up to $200 for each boy. The police didn't believe him at first. Henley then gave the names of some of the victims, so the police started to believe there was something to his claims. There was very damning evidence in Coral's house and van. For one, the bedroom floor was covered with plastic. Then the police found the hunting knife, multiple pairs of handcuffs, adult toys, and a ton of rope. Henry agreed to show the police where the victims were. Brooks went to the Houston Police Department with his father on August 8th and gave a statement. He claimed that he had no knowledge of the murders, but admitted that he knew that Coral had essayed and killed the 2 boys in 1970. Henley gave a full written statement about both of his and Brooks' involvement. Henley stated that he personally ended 9 lives and assisted Coral with the others. He said there were only 3 murders that Brooks wasn't involved in. Brooks gave a confession on August 9th and admitted to being there when the killings happened and helped with a lot of the burials. He continued to deny that he participated in killing anyone. Brooks said that Henley was sadistic like Coral.
Mama.
Who's this?
It's Wayne.
Yes, this is Mama, baby.
Mama?
Huh?
Dean.
Wayne?
Ma'am?
What are you doing?
Yeah, yes.
Oh, God.
In 1973, Brooks led the police to where Jeffrey's body was buried. Forensic scientists concluded that Jeffrey was manually strangled, bound, and essayed. Over the next few days, both Henley and Brooks accompanied the police to search for the bodies. The total number of victims were 28. At the time, this was the worst killing spree in the U.S. The families of the missing boys were very critical of the Houston Police Department because of the police had quickly written their children off as runaways. Others said the police should have investigated the matter better and connected the dots that the boys were almost all missing from Houston Heights. Everett Waldrop, the father of Donald and Jerry, had told the police back in 1971 that it looked like Coral was burying bodies by his boat shed. The police did go out there and do a quick search, but just dismissed it without any further investigation. Every time Everett went to the police, the chief would say to him, "Why are you down here? You know your boys are runaways."
This entire story would almost appear to be fiction, scripted with the full intention of shocking readers over and over again. It's that hard to believe. So many lives involved, so many killed over such a long period of time, and all of it going undetected. But it's not fiction. It's very real. A deadly conspiracy now listed as one of the most horrifying crimes in this century. An innocent-looking Pasadena home, but some of the people who went in were carried out in plastic bags. They had been murdered. Death in most cases came after the victims had been subjected to various acts and torture. The victims were all boys in the early to mid-teens who allegedly had been lured into a death trap by this young man, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley. It was Henley who unveiled this secret of mass killings and led police to the graves of the dead. Henley called the police to the home of Dean Corll. He said he killed that Pasadena resident. Henley said the 34-year-old Corll had talked about killing several young men and burying them in this boat storage in South Houston. Henley said he and 2 other young people were intended victims Wednesday morning. At that time, they had passed out at Corll's house after an all-night party.
I woke up and he was clamping handcuffs on me. I was laying on my stomach. The other 2 were on their stomach and they were handcuffed and their feet were tied. I'd him if he'd let me go.
What, he wants you to kill them then?
To begin with, he wanted to kill me. He was mad because I brought the chick over there. The chick wanted to run away from home and I was going to travel with Dean. I thought it was safe. I didn't know no better.
Henley said Corll did turn him loose, and then he described what happened next to the others, another young man and a teenage girl.
He let me up and took them into a bedroom and strapped them to the board. Strapped Tim on his stomach, spread eagle on the board, and strapped Rhonda beside the board beside Tim on her back. First he wanted Tim to take Rhonda, but Tim couldn't or he wouldn't or something. And so he wanted me to take her, and he was going to mess with Tim.
And Henley says he shot Corll repeatedly. Henley's initial story makes it sound as if he were in effect a hero, but police suspicions were confirmed the next day. Henley said he had been involved in the murder and burial of some victims found in the dirt floor of this storage shed. For most of Wednesday night, lawmen continued to unearth bodies. All supposedly young boys, early to mid-teens, all had their hands tied, the bodies wrapped in plastic. Lime had been poured over the victims to help decompose the bodies. It did a more than adequate job. Bits and pieces of skeletons were removed time and time again. In some cases, flesh clung to bones like jelly. The stench inside that shed was almost overpowering. Those with weak stomachs stayed out. Just before closing down the digging operations for that night, a lieutenant in the Houston Homicide Division talked about the victims, and he talked about the killers. How would you classify this series of crimes?
Just like I said a while ago, hell of a sadistic type of a clown that'd pull something like this.
And you think most of these victims are young boys?
I'm pretty reasonably sure they are. The reports that we have, missing persons, are all a bunch of kids, 13, 14, 15 years old.
The death site and the grave site itself appears tragic enough, but do you think many of them went under any torture?
Well, when you're fooling with a nut like this, that's a pervert, you can expect most anything.
So the digging operation ceased for that night. Now the public knew 8 bodies had been found in this shed, but this was just beginning, and that became evident the following day, Thursday. Lawmen returned to the grave site. Shovels again dug into the soil in the 12 by 30 shed. The death count started rising. There was another body, and still another, and another. When the digging was finally completed in this shed, 17 bodies had been recovered. According to the owners of the boat storage, Dean Corll had always been prompt in paying his rent on this boat stall, which he had for nearly 3 years. Recently, he had been politely asking the owners if they didn't have another stall for rent. He said his was getting too crowded. The trail of graves stretched into the piney woods of East Texas near Sam Rayburn Lake, not too far from Lufkin. Henley told lawmen that he helped Corll bury more victims in this area. At this time, 18-year-old David Brooks of Houston was also in custody as a suspect. Henley pointed to one spot and said, "There are 2 bodies here, but only one was uncovered." So Henley said, "That means there are 2 at the other site." Again, the shovels dug in, and Henley decided to start talking again also.
Now, these just some boys that he picked up, or I helped him get, rather, and he raped them, ended up killing them, brought them down here and buried them.
What part did you play in any of the killing, or did you?
No comment.
Wayne, this has been going on for some time, hasn't it?
Everybody dropping that kind of credit card bill? No?
A year ago last winter.
That's when you got into it.
Yes.
Now, you know, or you think you know, that maybe he was involved in this more than a year ago, right?
I know.
In what way do you know?
And I was told.
By him?
By him. By David Brooks.
Now, David Brooks is another person who has been named. Now, what role did he play in all of this?
Same as mine.
The digging at the second spot produced only one more body before lawmen decided to call a halt for the night. They were to return the next morning, and they would uncover 2 more victims. That meant one Henley didn't know about. In other words, how many others could have been killed before Henley or Brooks became a part of all of this? It was possible, Henley said, that Carl had other young men working for him in the past, using them to procure boys for his sexual fantasies, using them to pimp for him, and then later killing them just as he started to murder Henley. Yesterday, the trail of graves took lawmen and newsmen to the southeast of Houston. Henley and Brooks said there were more bodies buried along the Gulf of Mexico. By now, the scene was becoming all too familiar. Shovels digging into dirt and yielding bodies. Heavy equipment was called in to assist in the recovery operations. Since there were few landmarks along the beach, Henley was having some trouble recalling the graves, but his directions did uncover more human remains. The white of lime mixed with the red of blood, bones, bits of flesh, again the undescribable smell of a decayed human body. The operations moved down the beach. At one point it stopped beside this camper. A Beaumont family out to spend a quiet day along the Gulf learned that they were within 10 feet of another victim. As the digging started and revealed the remains of still another body, the family packed up their camper. Yes, they had heard about the mass killings, but to learn that they were at the same spot where a teenage boy had been buried under 2 feet of sand, the Beaumont couple and their son headed for home. Before Henley and Brooks were returned to jail, Henley wanted to talk to reporters. He had told me earlier that the stories he read in the newspapers contained lies. Henley said he wanted to clear up and correct things, like his full name, and what happened to that girl at Carl's house Tuesday night and Wednesday morning, and a couple of other things most important to him.
And when that boy turned himself in, I had not yet made a statement. I didn't make a statement till after he made his. So I didn't implicate him. He hung himself. That's all I want to say. I never said there were 30 people. I said 24. The name's Junior, not Elmer Wayne Henley. Well, get your pictures.
Henley and Brooks had separate trials. Henley was charged with 6 murders after all of the evidence. The jury only deliberated for 92 minutes before finding him guilty of all 6 counts. He received 99 years for each murder, for a total of 594 years behind bars. Brooks would only be charged with 1 murder and sentenced to life in prison. Brooks showed no emotion when the sentence was handed down. His wife, who was at his trial, was crying. Brooks continued to appeal this decision until it was dismissed in May of '79. Brooks stayed in prison until he died of COVID on May 28, 2020. Henley is still in prison. All of his parole applications have been denied. The next time he can apply for parole is October 2025.
On the surface, Charles Albright seemed like an ordinary man. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and even had a charming side. But beneath that polished exterior lay something much darker, something twisted. They would later call him the Eyeball Killer, a name as chilling as the crimes he was accused of committing.
It started in the early 1990s in Dallas, Texas. Women were disappearing, women who worked the streets, who were often overlooked. When their bodies were found, police noticed something deeply disturbing. Their eyes were gone. Not gouged out in a frenzy, not sloppily removed, but surgically extracted with precision. Whoever was doing this knew exactly what they were doing.
But what she found next was unlike anything she'd seen before.
Everything was routine about that case until I went to examine her eye color.
She opened one eye, and then she opened another eye, and there was this infinitely long silence. And she finally said, "My God, the eyeballs are gone."
The case baffled investigators. The level of skill suggested someone with medical training, a doctor, a surgeon. The list of possibilities was overwhelming. Then a name surfaced. Charles Albright. A man with a fascination for eyes, a man who studied medicine but never became a doctor, a man with a history of deception and a habit of collecting things, photos, taxidermy specimens, even anatomical books about the human body.
This was not an operation you learn in medical school. The eyeballs were cut so precisely that they had to get the knife underneath the eyelid and then cut the 6 major muscle groups that connected the eyeball to the socket, and then shut the eyes in such a way that you couldn't even tell there was scarring around those eyes. She was so dumbfounded at what she saw because there was nothing in a textbook that even showed anything like this.
Albright had always been different. Adopted as a baby, he was raised by an overbearing mother who pushed him to excel but kept him under tight control. To outsiders, he was a precocious and fun-loving child, the kind of kid that would name every constellation, catch snakes without fear, and charm an audience with a tap dance routine. Behind closed doors, his mother's influence shaped his strange ways. She obsessed over his cleanliness, changing his clothes multiple times a day and warning him of the filth of the world. She tied him to his bed when he wouldn't nap. She took him to see polio patients in iron lungs, telling him he could end up there if he wasn't careful. And when he was just a baby, she locked him in a dark room as punishment for chewing on her tape measure.
Yet for all her rigid control, it was Dell Albright who first introduced Charles to the things that would later define his darkest urges, taxidermy. When he was 11, she enrolled him in a mail-order taxidermy course, and together they worked on his first specimens. She showed him how to use the scalpel to skin a bird, how to scoop out its brains, how to cut the flesh cleanly from its eye sockets. He took to it quickly, showing an almost artistic precision in his work.
Then came the final step, the eyes. Charles was captivated by them. At the taxidermy shop, he would stare at rows of artificial glass eyes, marveling at their lifelike glint. Dell refused to buy them. They were too expensive, she said. Instead, she had a different solution. She reached into her sewing kit and handed him buttons. One by one, Charles Albright's birds were completed, not with glass eyes, but with cold black buttons sewn where their gaze should have been.
Years later, as Dallas police hunted a killer who removed the eyes from his victims with surgical precision, they would look back at Albright's childhood and wonder, had the signs always been there? When police zeroed in on him, it wasn't because of a smoking gun or a clear-cut confession. It was whispers, shadows, and stories of women who had barely escaped him. A witness came forward, terrified but certain. She had seen him, she had survived him, and that was enough.
Brenda White. At 17 years old, already a veteran prostitute. White said she once had a run-in with a customer who matched the description of the perpetrator.
Brenda got into the car with the suspect, and the suspect did not want to do what Brenda normally did on her trucks.
How much?
25 straight.
Get it.
She wanted to go to a hotel, and the suspect wanted to just drive around. And she told him, no, we're not having that, basically.
You can stay.
And that is when the suspect began attacking her, trying to choke her. He was saying, I hate hoes. I'm going to kill all you hoes. And she said, oh, you're a damn lie. And she pulled out her mace, and she maced him and was able to get out of that car. She ran for her life, and Brenda remembered every detail of the suspect's face.
In 1991, Charles Albright was arrested, charged with the murder of Shirley Williams. Though he was suspected in multiple cases, the evidence was thin, fragile, and circumstantial. But the jury saw enough. They saw the pattern, the obsession, the way everything about him fit into the puzzle, even if some pieces were still missing. He was sentenced to life in prison, though to the very end he insisted he was innocent.
Charles Albright admits he's fascinated with eyes, but says that doesn't make him a killer.
I got 3 books that gave reference to taking out eyes. One of them, Stephen King. This gypsy had a little tiny spoon for removing eyeballs in a book called Thinner. And there was another reference in a book called Mine about if this woman catches me, and this woman had her baby, says I'll pull her eyes out and stuff them down her throat.
Despite the conviction, Charles Albright continues to maintain his innocence. Coincidentally, since Albright's incarceration, the murders in Oak Cliff have stopped.
Albright died in 2020, locked away in a psychiatric unit, but his case still lingers in the dark corners of true crime discussions. Some say he was a monster, a predator with a surgeon's touch. Others wonder if he was simply a man with too many secrets, caught in the perfect storm of fear and suspicion. Either way, the legend of the eyeball killer endures, his story as eerie and unsettling as the empty sockets left behind.